The book felt heavy in Alexander James's hands as he stood in the doorway, though it was just a paperback copy of something he'd borrowed months ago. The worn edges of the cover showed signs of being handled repeatedly, pages dog-eared from his nervous habit of folding corners when he was thinking. He should have returned it weeks earlier, but somehow he kept finding reasons to hold on to it. It had become a talisman of sorts, a tangible excuse to maintain connection when everything else felt too complicated to navigate. Now standing at Nicholas Wood's apartment door at nearly 9 in the evening, with the hallway lights casting long shadows and the distant sound of television programs filtering through other doors, he realized he wasn't here about the book at all. Nicholas opened the door wider, stepping back to let him in, but Alexander remained frozen on the threshold. The warm light from inside spilled around Nicholas's silhouette, catching the concern in his dark eyes as he studied Alexander's face with that intense focus that had become so familiar over the months of their friendship. The apartment behind Nicholas looked inviting, filled with the soft glow of lamps and the comfortable clutter of a life being lived. "You could have just texted me that you were returning it," Nicholas said softly, his voice carrying that gentle quality that had been haunting Alexander's thoughts for months, the tone that suggested he understood there were layers beneath every conversation they had. "You didn't have to come all the way over here, especially this late." Alexander's grip tightened on the book, his knuckles showing white against the faded cover. "I know." They stood there in the doorway, the evening air cool against Alexander's back while warmth radiated from Nicholas's apartment. Something electric passed between them in the silence. Something that had been building for so long that Alexander could barely remember when it started. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that one step forward would change everything forever. Nicholas's gaze dropped briefly to Alexander's lips before flicking back up, and in that moment, everything Alexander had been trying to ignore came rushing to the surface like a dam breaking. "Alex," Nicholas whispered, and the way he said his name made Alexander's heart stutter in his chest, made his breath catch in his throat like he'd forgotten how to breathe properly. "Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take you on an emotional journey you won't forget, but to understand how they arrived at this moment, we need to go back to the beginning, to when Alexander James first realized he was falling for his best friend and didn't know what to do about it. 3 months earlier, Alexander had been sitting at his kitchen table, staring at his phone as another text from his ex-girlfriend went unanswered. The relationship had ended badly just 2 weeks prior, with her accusing him of being emotionally unavailable, of never really being present even when he was right there beside her. She'd thrown her keys on his coffee table and told him that loving him was like trying to hold water in her hands. She wasn't wrong, but Alexander hadn't understood why until Nicholas Wood moved into the apartment across the hall. Nicholas had arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in late June with nothing but 2 suitcases and a determination to start over after his own messy breakup. Alexander had been leaving for work, running late as usual, and juggling his coffee, briefcase, and umbrella, when he'd seen this stranger struggling with his key in the hallway, cursing softly under his breath as rain dripped from his dark hair onto the worn carpet. The hallway had smelled like old paint and the faint scent of someone cooking breakfast, and the fluorescent light overhead had been flickering in that annoying way it had done for months. "Need help?" Alexander had offered, setting down his briefcase and moving closer. And when Nicholas looked up, something in Alexander's chest had shifted permanently. Nicholas had the kind of eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations, warm brown with flecks of gold that caught the light, expressive in a way that made Alexander feel seen in a manner he'd never experienced before. His hair was slightly too long, curling at the edges where the rain had dampened it, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that Alexander would later learn came from a childhood accident involving a bicycle and a particularly stubborn tree. When Nicholas smiled, thanking him for the offer, Alexander felt something click into place that he hadn't even realized was missing. "I think the lock is just temperamental," Nicholas had said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested he had been up too late the night before. "The landlord warned me about it, but I thought he was exaggerating." "He wasn't," Alexander had replied, fishing his own keys from his pocket. "Here, let me show you the trick. You have to turn it slightly to the left first, then back to the right while pushing up on the handle." Their hands had brushed as Alexander demonstrated the technique, and Alexander had felt a jolt of something he couldn't quite name. Nicholas had smelled like rain and coffee and something else, something clean and masculine that made Alexander want to lean closer. That first conversation had lasted 20 minutes, both of them standing in the hallway as other tenants stepped around them with varying degrees of annoyance and amusement. Nicholas was a freelance graphic designer, recently out of a 3-year relationship with someone who'd never understood his need for creative space. He'd moved from across town, wanting a fresh start in a neighborhood where he didn't have memories on every corner. Alexander found himself sharing more than he usually did with strangers, talking about his job at the marketing firm and how he'd been feeling stuck lately, like he was going through the motions of a life that didn't quite fit. Maybe that's just part of growing up, Nicholas had said, but his eyes suggested he understood exactly what Alexander meant. Sometimes I think we spend so much time trying to become who we think we should be that we forget to figure out who we actually are. By the end of that first week, they'd fallen into an easy routine that felt as natural as breathing. Nicholas would knock on Alexander's door, around 7 in the evening, usually with takeout containers from whatever new restaurant he'd discovered during his explorations of the neighborhood, or with ingredients for dinner and a plan to cook something together. They'd eat at Alexander's small kitchen table or on the couch while watching whatever was on television, talking about their days, their work, their thoughts on everything from politics to the best pizza places in the city. Alexander had never experienced friendship like this, so natural and effortless that it felt like coming home to himself. Nicholas was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in Alexander's thoughts and opinions, and he had a way of listening that made Alexander feel like every word mattered. He was funny too, with a dry sense of humor that caught Alexander off guard and made him laugh until his sides hurt. The problem was that somewhere between those shared dinners and late-night conversations that stretched past midnight, Alexander's feelings had shifted into something more complicated. He'd catch himself watching the way Nicholas's hands moved when he talked, elegant and expressive, or noticing how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. When Nicholas would lean closer during their conversations, close enough that Alexander could see the individual lashes framing his eyes, Alexander would feel his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with friendship. It had taken Alexander weeks to admit to himself what was happening, and even longer to accept it. He'd never been attracted to men before, had never questioned his sexuality beyond the occasional fleeting thought that he quickly dismissed as curiosity or admiration. His dating history was exclusively women, relationships that had felt comfortable, if not particularly passionate. But with Nicholas, everything felt different. The attraction wasn't just physical, though Alexander couldn't deny the way his breath caught when Nicholas would stretch, his shirt riding up to reveal a strip of skin, or the way his stomach fluttered when Nicholas would run his fingers through his hair while thinking. It was deeper than that, an emotional pull that made Alexander want to know every thought in Nicholas's head, every dream he'd ever had, every fear that kept him awake at night. The realization had hit him one evening in late September like a physical blow. They'd been watching a movie on Alexander's couch, some romantic comedy that Nicholas had picked from the selection at the video store down the street, and during a particularly cheesy scene where the male lead was declaring his love in the rain, Nicholas had turned to make a joke about the impracticality of grand romantic gestures. Their faces had been inches apart, close enough that Alexander could see the individual flecks of gold in Nicholas's brown eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath against his skin, and for a moment, Alexander had been certain Nicholas was about to kiss him. The air between them had felt charged, full of possibility and unspoken words, and Alexander had found himself leaning forward slightly, his heart hammering against his ribs. But then Nicholas had pulled back, clearing his throat and turning back to the screen with a casualness that felt forced, and Alexander had been left wondering if he'd imagined the entire moment. The rest of the movie had passed in a blur of confused thoughts and racing heartbeats, Alexander hyper-aware of every movement Nicholas made beside him. That night, after Nicholas had gone back to his own apartment with a cheerful goodnight and a promise to see him tomorrow, Alexander had lain awake staring at the ceiling, finally acknowledging what he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. He was falling in love with his best friend, and he had no idea what to do about it. The next few weeks had been torture, a careful dance of trying to act normal while his entire world had shifted on its axis. Alexander found himself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs that Nicholas might feel the same way, searching for hidden meanings in casual touches and lingering glances. Sometimes he thought he caught Nicholas watching him with something more than friendship in his eyes, a softness that made Alexander's chest tight with hope. Other times, Nicholas would touch his arm or shoulder in a way that seemed to linger longer than necessary. His fingers warmed through the fabric of Alexander's shirt, and Alexander would wonder if he was reading too much into innocent gestures. The uncertainty was eating at him, making it difficult to concentrate at work and impossible to sleep properly. He'd started declining some of Nicholas's invitations for dinner, claiming he was busy with work or tired, anything to avoid the temptation of spending more time in close proximity to the object of his growing obsession. It wasn't entirely a lie. The emotional exhaustion of hiding his feelings was wearing him down, making everything feel like it required monumental effort. Nicholas had noticed the distance, of course. He was too observant, too attuned to Alexander's moods, not to pick up on the subtle changes. One evening in mid-October, he'd shown up at Alexander's door with Chinese takeout from their favorite place and a determined expression that suggested he wasn't taking no for an answer. "Okay, what's going on?" Nicholas had asked, setting the food on Alexander's kitchen table and turning to face him with crossed arms, his usual easy smile replaced by something more serious. "You've been weird for weeks. Distant. Did I do something wrong?" Alexander's heart had clenched at the hurt in Nicholas's voice, at the genuine confusion in his eyes. "No, you didn't do anything wrong." "Then what is it?" "I thought we were friends, Alex. Good friends. But lately you act like you can barely stand to be in the same room as me." Nicholas had run a hand through his hair, a gesture Alexander had learned meant he was frustrated or upset. "If I did something to offend you, just tell me. We can work through it." The accusation had stung because it was so far from the truth. Alexander wanted to be in the same room as Nicholas all the time. He wanted to wake up next to him and fall asleep in his arms and tell him about every stupid thought that crossed his mind during the day. He wanted things he'd never wanted with anyone before, and it terrified him more than he'd ever been terrified of anything. "It's complicated," Alexander had said finally, sinking into one of his kitchen chairs and avoiding Nicholas's searching gaze. Nicholas had sat across from him, his expression softening with concern. "Try me. I'm pretty good with complicated. And whatever it is, it can't be worse than this weird distance between us." But Alexander hadn't been ready. The words had felt too big, too dangerous, too likely to destroy the most important relationship in his life. Instead, he deflected, claiming work stress and promising to be better about making time for their friendship. Nicholas had accepted the explanation with obvious reluctance, but Alexander could see the doubt in his eyes, the hurt he was trying to hide. Things had improved for a while after that conversation, at least on the surface. Alexander had made an effort to act normal, to push down his feelings and focus on preserving their friendship. But the attraction hadn't gone anywhere. If anything, it had grown stronger as autumn deepened into winter, fed by their continued closeness and the intimate moments that seemed to happen despite Alexander's best efforts to maintain appropriate boundaries. There had been moments that made Alexander wonder if his feelings might be reciprocated, moments that kept him awake at night, replaying every word and gesture. Like the night in November when they'd been walking back from dinner at a new Italian place Nicholas had wanted to try, and it had started to rain. They ducked under a storefront awning, standing close together as they waited for the downpour to ease, and Nicholas had been shivering slightly in his thin jacket. Without thinking, Alexander had stepped closer, sharing his body heat, and Nicholas had looked up at him with an expression Alexander couldn't quite read, something soft and questioning that made his heart race. For a moment, standing there in the dim light with rain drumming on the awning above them, Alexander had thought about kissing him right there on the sidewalk. But then the rain had stopped, and the moment had passed, and they'd walked home making casual conversation about the weather as if nothing had happened. Or the evening in early December when they'd been decorating Alexander's apartment for the holidays, a tradition they'd fallen into without discussing it. Nicholas had been hanging lights around the window while Alexander untangled a string of garland that had somehow become impossibly knotted during its year in storage. and they'd been talking about childhood Christmas memories. Nicholas had mentioned feeling lonely during the holidays since his breakup, how the apartment felt too quiet and empty during what was supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year, and Alexander had found himself saying, "You don't have to be lonely. You have me." The words had come out more intimate than Alexander had intended, loaded with meaning he hadn't meant to reveal. Nicholas had gone very still on the stepladder, his hands frozen on the string of lights he'd been arranging. And when he looked down at Alexander, there had been something vulnerable in his expression, something that made Alexander's chest tight with hope and terror in equal measure. "Do I?" Nicholas had asked quietly, and the question had felt loaded with meaning Alexander wasn't sure he understood. "Really have you, I mean?" "Always," Alexander had replied without thinking, and he'd meant it in every possible way. Meant it with his whole heart and soul. Nicholas had climbed down from the stepladder slowly, never breaking eye contact with Alexander, moving with a deliberation that made the air between them feel thick with possibility. They'd stood facing each other in the living room, surrounded by half-hung decorations and the soft glow of the lights Nicholas had already put up. The smell of pine from the tree they'd bought together filling the space between them. The air had felt thick with unspoken words, and Alexander had been certain that this time something was going to happen, that they were finally going to acknowledge what had been building between them for months. But then Alexander's phone had rung, shrill and insistent in the quiet apartment, shattering the moment like glass. It had been his mother, calling to discuss Christmas plans and family dinner arrangements. And by the time Alexander had finished the conversation, apologizing repeatedly for the interruption, Nicholas had gone back to hanging lights as if nothing had happened, humming softly under his breath with a casualness that felt forced. These almost moments had become a pattern, building tension that Alexander didn't know how to resolve. He'd started having dreams about Nicholas, vivid and intense dreams that left him waking up with his heart racing and his body aching with want. During their conversations, he'd catch himself staring at Nicholas's mouth, wondering what it would feel like to kiss him, what sounds he might make, how his lips would taste. The wanting had become a constant ache in his chest, something he carried with him everywhere, a secret that felt too big for his body to contain. The breaking point had come just 2 weeks ago, on a Thursday evening that had started like any other. Alexander had been having a particularly difficult day at work, dealing with a demanding client who kept changing their requirements at the last minute, sending him revision after revision with increasingly unreasonable deadlines. He'd come home exhausted and frustrated, his head pounding and his patience worn thin. And Nicholas had taken one look at him and immediately gone into caretaking mode. "Rough day?" Nicholas had asked, appearing in Alexander's doorway with a bottle of wine and a concerned expression. And when Alexander had nodded, too tired to even pretend everything was fine, Nicholas had guided him to the couch and disappeared into the kitchen. He'd returned with a glass of wine and had settled beside Alexander, close enough that their thighs were touching, radiating warmth and comfort. "Want to talk about it?" Nicholas had offered, his voice gentle and patient, and something about his tone had broken through all of Alexander's carefully constructed defenses. Alexander had found himself spilling everything, not just about work, but about how lost he'd been feeling lately, how nothing in his life seemed to fit anymore except for their friendship. He talked about feeling like he was sleepwalking through his days, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly meaningless. Nicholas had listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions or making soft sounds of understanding, his presence steady and comforting. "I think you're being too hard on yourself," Nicholas had said when Alexander finished, his hand coming to rest on Alexander's knee in a gesture that felt both comforting and electric. "You're going through a transition period. That's normal. You're figuring out who you are and what you want. What if I already know what I want?" The words had slipped out before Alexander could stop them, loaded with more meaning than he'd intended, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Nicholas had gone very still beside him, his hand freezing on Alexander's knee. "What do you mean?" Alexander's heart had been pounding so hard he was sure Nicholas could hear it, could feel it through the couch cushions. This was his chance to be honest, to finally tell Nicholas how he felt, to stop living in the space between friendship and something more. But the fear of losing their friendship had been overwhelming, paralyzing in its intensity, and instead of confessing, Alexander had deflected again. I mean, what if I want something I can't have? He'd said carefully, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. Nicholas had turned to face him fully, his eyes searching Alexander's face with an intensity that made Alexander feel exposed, like Nicholas could see straight through him to all the secrets he'd been keeping. Like what? The question had hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and unspoken truths. Alexander had felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong word would send him plummeting into unknown territory. But before he could find the courage to answer honestly, to finally tell Nicholas the truth, Nicholas's phone had buzzed with a text message, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet apartment. Nicholas had glanced at it and sighed, the moment broken. Sorry, I need to take this. It's about a project deadline that's been moved up. The moment had been lost, and Alexander had spent the rest of the evening wondering if he'd imagined the intensity in Nicholas's eyes, the way he'd seemed to be waiting for Alexander to say something specific. They'd finished their wine and ordered pizza and watched a movie, but the easy comfort of earlier had been replaced by a tension that neither of them acknowledged. That night had been the last time they'd had one of their long, intimate conversations. Since then, Alexander had been even more careful about maintaining boundaries, terrified that he had already revealed too much, that Nicholas had seen through his carefully constructed facade. But the distance was killing him, and apparently it was affecting Nicholas too, which brought them to tonight. To Alexander standing in Nicholas's doorway with a book he could have returned weeks ago, trying to find the courage to say what he'd been holding back for months. Alex, Nicholas said again, his voice softer now, tinged with something that might have been hope. Come inside, please. Alexander stepped across the threshold, and Nicholas closed the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. The apartment smelled like the vanilla candle Nicholas always lit in the evenings, a scent that had become associated with comfort and safety in Alexander's mind, with long conversations and shared laughter. But tonight, everything felt different, charged with the weight of unspoken truths and possibilities that had been building for months. You want some coffee? Nicholas, though he made no move toward the kitchen. He was studying Alexander's face with that intense focus that always made Alexander feel like Nicholas could see straight through him, like he was reading a book written in a language only he understood. I'm not really here about the book, Alexander said, the words coming out in a rush, tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out before he lost his nerve. Nicholas nodded slowly, unsurprised. I know. You know? Alex, you've been carrying that book around for weeks. I've seen it in your car, on your kitchen counter, in your bag when we go out. If you wanted to return it, you would have done it already. Nicholas took a step closer, and Alexander's breath caught in his throat. So why are you really here? This was it, the moment Alexander had been both dreading and hoping for, the crossroads where he had to choose between safety and truth. He could deflect again, make some excuse and leave, and they could go back to their careful dance around each other, pretending that the tension between them was imaginary. Or he could be brave, for once in his life, and tell Nicholas the truth that had been burning in his chest for months. I think I'm falling in love with you, Alexander said, the words barely above a whisper, so quiet he wasn't sure Nicholas had heard them. Nicholas went very still, his eyes widening slightly, and for a moment that felt like an eternity. The only sound in the apartment was the soft hum of the heater and Alexander's rapid heartbeat thundering in his ears. Alexander felt exposed, vulnerable, like he'd just handed Nicholas his heart and was waiting to see if it would be handled with care or crushed entirely. Think? Nicholas asked finally, his voice rough with something Alexander couldn't identify. Alexander swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. No, I know. I know I'm falling in love with you. I have been for months. And I know this probably ruins everything between us. But I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep acting like being around you doesn't make me want things I've never wanted before. Nicholas was staring at him with an expression Alexander couldn't read. Something between shock and wonder and something else that made Alexander's heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded with possibility, and Alexander felt panic rising in his chest like a tide. "I should go," Alexander said, taking a step backward toward the door, his face burning with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. I just—" "Don't!" Nicholas's voice was sharp, stopping Alexander mid-retreat. "Don't you dare apologize for telling me the truth." Alexander froze, hope and terror warring in his chest, afraid to breathe in case he broke whatever spell was holding this moment together. "Do you know how long I've been waiting for you to say that?" Nicholas asked. And there was something raw in his voice that made Alexander's knees weak. Something vulnerable and honest. It had cut straight through his panic. "What?" Nicholas laughed, but it sounded more like a song, shaky and breathless. "God, Alex, I thought I was going crazy. All those moments between us, all those times I thought you might feel the same way, and then you'd pull back and I'd convince myself I was imagining things." Alexander's world tilted on its axis, everything he thought he knew shifting into new configurations. "You feel the same way?" Instead of answering with words, Nicholas closed the distance between them in two quick steps, his movements urgent and determined. His hands came up to frame Alexander's face, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with infinite gentleness, and Alexander felt like he might dissolve under the tenderness of the touch. "I've been in love with you since that first week," Nicholas said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching Alexander's face like he was memorizing every detail. "Since you helped me with my key in the hallway and then stood there talking to me like you had all the time in the world. I've never felt anything like this before, Alex. Never wanted anyone the way I want you." Alexander's eyes fluttered closed as Nicholas's words washed over him, relief and joy and disbelief flooding through him in equal measure. "I was so scared," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I've never felt this way about a man before. I didn't know what it meant. Didn't know if you could ever feel the same way." "Hey," Nicholas said softly, his thumbs still tracing gentle patterns on Alexander's cheekbones, waiting until Alexander opened his eyes to continue. "Look at me. I've never felt this way about anyone before, man or woman. What I feel for you, it's not about gender. It's about you. It's about how you make me laugh even when I'm having the worst day. How you listen to me when I talk about my work like it actually matters. It's about how safe I feel with you. How right everything feels when we're together." Tears were threatening at the corners of Alexander's eyes, overwhelming emotion making his chest tight. "I thought I was losing my mind. Every time we were together, I wanted to touch you, wanted to kiss you. I kept thinking I was reading things into innocent moments." "They weren't innocent," Nicholas said, his thumb tracing along Alexander's jawline with reverent care. "At least not on my part. Every time I touched you, every time I looked at you, I was hoping you'd see how I felt. I was hoping you'd give me some sign that you wanted more too." "I wanted to," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "God, I wanted to so badly, but I was terrified of ruining our friendship. You mean too much to me to risk losing you." "You're not going to lose me," Nicholas promised, his forehead coming to rest against Alexander's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Not ever, but Alex, we can't keep dancing around this. I can't keep pretending that being your friend is enough when what I want is to fall asleep next to you every night and wake up in your arms every morning." Alexander's breath hitched at the image Nicholas painted, at the future he was describing with such certainty. "Is that what you want?" "That's just the beginning of what I want," Nicholas said, his voice dropping lower, becoming rougher with desire and honesty. "I want everything with you, Alex. I want to take you on dates and hold your hand in public and introduce you as my boyfriend. I want to know what you taste like, what sounds you make when I kiss you. I want to learn every inch of your body and spend the rest of my life making you happy." The words sent heat racing through Alexander's veins, desire pooling low in his stomach in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. He dreamed of Nicholas saying things like this to him, had imagined conversations like this in his most secret fantasies. But the reality was so much more intense than his imagination had ever been. "Can I kiss you?" Nicholas asked, his forehead resting against Alexander's now, their noses almost touching. "Please, Alex, I've been wanting to kiss you for so long." Instead of answering with words, Alexander closed the final distance between them, pressing his lips to Nicholas's in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first, both of them almost afraid to believe this was really happening. But as soon as their lips met, something ignited between them. Months of suppressed desire and longing finally finding an outlet. Nicholas tasted like coffee and something uniquely him, something Alexander wanted to spend hours exploring. When Nicholas's tongue traced along Alexander's lower lip, asking for permission, Alexander opened for him with a soft moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound he'd never made before but that felt completely natural in this moment. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent as they both realized this was real. This was happening. They were finally allowed to touch each other the way they'd been wanting to for months. Nicholas's hand slid from Alexander's face to his neck, then down to his shoulders, pulling him closer until there was no space left between their bodies. Alexander could feel Nicholas's heartbeat against his chest, rapid and strong, matching his own frantic rhythm. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Nicholas rested his forehead against Alexander's and smiled, a radiant expression that made Alexander's heart skip. "Wow," Alexander breathed. And Nicholas laughed softly, the sound full of joy and relief. "Yeah, wow." Nicholas's hands were still on Alexander's shoulders, his thumbs tracing small circles through the fabric of Alexander's shirt. "That was even better than I imagined." "You imagine kissing me?" Alexander asked, and he could hear the wonder in his own voice, still hardly able to believe this was real. "Every night for months," Nicholas admitted without shame. "I'd lie in bed and think about what it would feel like to kiss you, to hold you. I'd imagine what you might say if I told you how I felt." Alexander's chest felt tight with emotion, overwhelmed by the realization that Nicholas had been experiencing the same longing, the same desperate want that had been consuming Alexander for months. "What did you imagine I'd say?" "Honestly, I was terrified you'd run away. I thought maybe you'd tell me you were flattered but that you didn't feel the same way, or that you'd never thought of me like that." Nicholas's expression grew vulnerable, showing Alexander glimpses of the fear he'd been carrying. "I never imagined you'd been feeling the same things I was." "I was so convinced you were straight," Alexander said, his hands coming up to rest on Nicholas's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his palms. "You talked about your ex-girlfriend, about dating women. I thought there was no way you'd ever see me as anything more than a friend." Nicholas cupped Alexander's face again, his touch gentle but sure. "I thought I was straight too, until I met you. I've never questioned my sexuality before, never looked at a man and felt attraction. But with you, it wasn't even about being attracted to a man. It was about being attracted to you, specifically. Your smile, your laugh, the way you get excited when you talk about something you're passionate about, the way you make me feel like the most interesting person in the world when you listen to me. You are the most interesting person in the world," Alexander said, meaning every word, his hands fisting slightly in Nicholas's shirt. Nicholas smiled, soft and radiant and full of love. "See, that's what I mean. You make me feel seen in a way I've never experienced before." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, both seemingly amazed that they were finally having this conversation, that the months of careful dancing around their feelings were over. Alexander felt like he was in a dream, like he might wake up at any moment to find himself alone in his bed, aching with want for something he could never have. "This is real, right?" Alexander asked, needing the reassurance. "This is actually happening?" "It's real," when Nicholas assured him, his voice firm and certain. "We're real. This thing between us, it's real." Alexander nodded, trying to process the magnitude of what had just changed between them, how their entire relationship had shifted in the space of a few minutes. "So what happens now?" "Now," Nicholas said, taking Alexander's hand and leading him toward the couch. "We figure it out together. We take it one day at a time and see where this goes." They settled on the couch, Nicholas pulling Alexander close so that he was tucked against Nicholas's side, his head resting on Nicholas's shoulder. It felt natural, like they'd been sitting this way for years instead of minutes, like this was where Alexander had always belonged. "I have to admit," Nicholas said, his fingers playing with Alexander's hair in a way that made Alexander want to purr like a cat. I'm a little scared. Yeah, Alexander tilted his head to look up at him, studying the vulnerability in Nicholas's expression. About what? About everything. About being with a man for the first time. About what people will think. About whether I'll be good at this. Whether I'll be what you need. Nicholas's voice was quiet, honest in a way that made Alexander's heart ache with love. I've never felt this way about anyone before, Alex. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Alexander shifted so he could face Nicholas more fully, his hand coming up to rest on Nicholas's chest. Hey, we're both figuring this out together. I've never been in love like this before either. I don't know what I'm doing any more than you do. But you've at least thought about being with men before, right? Alexander considered the question, wanting to be completely honest. Not really, no. I mean, there were moments over the years where I'd notice an attractive guy or wonder what it might be like, but I always dismissed those thoughts. I convinced myself they didn't mean anything. You're the first man I've ever actually wanted to be with. So we're both diving into the deep end, Nicholas said with a small laugh that held more nervousness than humor. Looks like it. Alexander reached up to touch Nicholas's face, marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do this now, that he could touch Nicholas whenever he wanted. But I'd rather dive into the deep end with you than stay in the shallow end with anyone else. Nicholas turned his head to press a kiss to Alexander's palm, the gesture so tender it made Alexander's chest tight with emotion. I love that. And I love you. The words sent a thrill through Alexander that he felt all the way to his toes, a warmth that spread through his entire body. I love you too. God, it feels good to finally say that out loud. They spent the next hour talking, sharing all the moments over the past few months when they'd wanted to say something, all the times they'd almost kissed, all the ways they'd been falling for each other without realizing the feeling was mutual. It was cathartic and wonderful, like finally being able to breathe after holding their breath for months. Remember that night we were decorating for Christmas? Nicholas asked, his arm tightening around Alexander as if he couldn't bear to let him go. When you asked if you really had me? Alexander smiled at the memory, at how charged that moment had felt. I wanted to kiss you so badly in that moment. I was hoping you would. I climbed down from that ladder thinking, this is it. This is when he's going to kiss me. And then your phone rang and the moment was gone. I could have killed my mother for calling right then, Alexander said. And Nicholas laughed, the sound rich and warm. What about that night when it was raining and we were under the awning? Nicholas asked, his fingers tracing patterns on Alexander's arm. You stepped so close to me, and I thought for sure you were going to make a move. I wanted to. I kept thinking about how easy it would be to just lean down and kiss you. But then I'd remember that you were supposedly straight, and I'd lose my nerve. I wish we'd been braver sooner, Nicholas said softly, and there was a note of regret in his voice. Maybe we needed this time, Alexander suggested, pressing closer to Nicholas's warmth. Maybe we needed to build this foundation first, to really get to know each other before we complicated things with romance. You think romance complicates things? Alexander considered this, thinking about how natural this felt despite being completely new territory for both of them. I think it changes things, but maybe not in a bad way. Maybe it just makes everything more intense, more meaningful. I like intense, Nicholas said, his voice dropping lower in a way that made Alexander's stomach flutter. I like meaningful. Alexander felt heat pool in his stomach at Nicholas's tone, at the way his eyes had darkened slightly. Yeah. Nicholas's hand slid up to cup the back of Alexander's neck, his thumb tracing along Alexander's hairline in a way that made Alexander shiver. I like the way you're looking at me right now, too. Alexander was sure his face was flushed, could feel the heat spreading across his cheeks. The way Nicholas was touching him, the intimacy of their position on the couch, it was all making his head spin with want. How am I looking at you? Like you want me to kiss you again. I do want you to kiss me again, Alexander admitted without hesitation. I want you to kiss me a lot more. Nicholas's eyes darkened further, and Alexander could see desire flickering in their depths. Just kissing? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and promise. Alexander felt his pulse quicken as he considered what Nicholas was really asking, what he might be offering. I don't know, Alexander said honestly, his voice slightly breathless. I've never done this before, remember? I don't know what I want beyond knowing that I want you. That's okay, Nicholas said, his thumb still tracing gentle patterns on Alexander's neck in a way that was both soothing and arousing. We don't have to figure everything out tonight. We have time. Do we? Alexander asked, and he could hear the vulnerability in his own voice. I mean, what if this doesn't work? What if we try this and it ruins everything between us? Nicholas was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Do you really think that could happen? I don't know, maybe. I've never transitioned from friendship to romance before. What if we're better as friends? What if the romantic stuff doesn't work and we lose what we have? Alex, Nicholas said gently, his hand moving to cup Alexander's face. What we have as friends, that's not going anywhere. That's the foundation of this. The love I feel for you, it includes friendship, but it's bigger than that. Even if the romantic part didn't work, which I don't think will happen, we'd still have the connection we've built. You really believe that? I do, but I also think you're borrowing trouble. We haven't even been together for 2 hours and you're already worried about breaking up. Alexander laughed, recognizing the truth in Nicholas's words, the way his mind always jumped to worst-case scenarios. You're right, I'm overthinking this. You're scared, Nicholas corrected gently, which is normal. I'm scared too. But Alex, what we have, it's worth the risk. You're worth the risk. Alexander felt tears prick at his eyes again, overwhelmed by the certainty in Nicholas's voice. I've never had anyone say that to me before. Well, get used to it, Nicholas said with a smile that was both tender and mischievous, because I plan on telling you how amazing you are every single day. Every day? Every day. Starting now. Nicholas shifted so that he was facing Alexander more fully, his expression growing serious. You're brave, Alex. Braver than you think you are. It took courage to come here tonight, to tell me how you felt. It took courage to risk our friendship for the chance of something more. It didn't feel brave. It felt terrifying. That's what makes it brave, being scared and doing it anyway. Alexander leaned forward and kissed Nicholas again, softer this time, more exploratory. He was starting to learn the shape of Nicholas's mouth, the way he tasted, the small sound he made when Alexander's tongue traced along his lower lip. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing harder. I could do this all night, Nicholas murmured against Alexander's lips. Kiss me. Kiss you, hold you, talk to you, just be with you like this, without having to hide how I feel. We don't have to hide anymore, Alexander said, and the realization sent a thrill through him that was both exciting and terrifying. We can be together, really together. We can, Nicholas agreed, his smile radiant. Though I have to admit, I have no idea how to do this. How to be someone's boyfriend. I've never been in a relationship with a man before. I've never been in a relationship with anyone where I felt like this, Alexander said, his hand finding Nicholas's and intertwining their fingers. So we're both learning. What do you think will be different? Nicholas asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Being with me versus being with women? Alexander considered the question, thinking about his past relationships and how different this already felt. I think everything will be different because it's you. I don't think it's about you being a man so much as it's about you being the person I'm in love with. That's a good answer, Nicholas said with a smile, bringing their joined hands up to press a kiss to Alexander's knuckles. What about you? Do you think it'll be different? I think it already is different, Nicholas said thoughtfully. The way I feel about you, it's unlike anything I've ever experienced. With my ex-girlfriend, even at the beginning when things were good, there was always this sense that I was playing a part, trying to be the boyfriend she wanted. With you, I can just be myself. You can always be yourself with me, Alexander assured him, squeezing Nicholas's hand. I know. That's part of why I fell in love with you. They talked until nearly midnight, sharing fears and hopes and dreams for their future together. Alexander learned that Nicholas had been thinking about introducing him as his boyfriend to his family, that he'd been imagining taking Alexander home for holidays and having him meet his parents. Nicholas learned that Alexander had been fantasizing about waking up next to him, about lazy Sunday mornings in bed and cooking breakfast together, about building a life that included all the small domestic moments he'd never wanted with anyone else. "I want all of that," Alexander said when Nicholas described his vision of their future, his voice full of wonder and certainty. "I want holidays with your family and lazy mornings and everything in between." "Even the boring stuff?" Nicholas asked with a teasing smile. "Grocery shopping and doing laundry and arguing about whose turn it is to take out the trash?" "Especially the boring stuff," Alexander said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I want to build a real life with you, Nicholas. I want all of it." Nicholas kissed him again, deep and thorough and full of promise, and when they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, desire crackling between them like electricity. "Stay tonight," Nicholas said against Alexander's lips, his voice rough with want and affection. "Not for anything more than sleeping, just so I can hold you. I don't want this night to end." Alexander's heart clenched with love at the request, at the vulnerability in Nicholas's voice. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I want to fall asleep with you in my arms and wake up knowing this wasn't all a dream." "Okay," Alexander said, his voice soft with emotion. "Yes, I'd like that." They got ready for bed together, and there was something beautifully domestic about brushing their teeth side by side at Nicholas's bathroom sink, about Nicholas lending Alexander a t-shirt to sleep in that smelled like his detergent and something uniquely Nicholas. When they climbed into Nicholas's bed, Alexander felt a moment of nervousness, but it melted away when Nicholas pulled him close, Alexander's head resting on Nicholas's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "This feels right," Alexander said softly, his arm draping across Nicholas's waist, holding him close. "It does," Nicholas agreed, his fingers combing through Alexander's hair in a soothing rhythm. "It feels like coming home." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the magnitude of what had changed between them in the space of a few hours, how their entire world had shifted and realigned. Alexander felt peaceful in a way he hadn't in months, the constant ache of wanting something he thought he couldn't have finally replaced by the warm satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged. "Nicholas?" Alexander said into the darkness, his voice soft and sleepy. "Hmm? Thank you." "For what?" "For feeling the same way, for being brave enough to tell me, for making me feel like I'm not crazy for falling in love with my best friend." Nicholas's arms tightened around him, pulling him impossibly closer. "Thank you for coming over tonight, for finally telling me the truth, for giving us a chance." "I love you, pal," Alexander said, and the words felt easier now, more natural, like something he'd been saying his entire life. "I love you too," Nicholas replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Alexander's head. "Sweet dreams, Alex." Alexander fell asleep to the sound of Nicholas's breathing and the feeling of being completely, utterly loved. 3 weeks later, Alexander stood in Nicholas's kitchen, watching him make coffee in the morning light that streamed through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and warmth. They'd fallen into a natural rhythm over the past few weeks, spending most nights together and most mornings like this, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that felt like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. "Good morning, beautiful," Nicholas said, turning to kiss Alexander softly before handing him a mug of coffee prepared exactly the way he liked it, with just a splash of cream and no sugar. "Good morning," Alexander replied, still marveling at how natural this felt, how right it was to wake up next to Nicholas every day, to start each morning with gentle kisses and quiet conversation. They'd taken things slowly over the past 3 weeks, learning each other's bodies and desires with patience and care, exploring this new dimension of their relationship with wonder and reverence. Every kiss still felt like a small miracle to Alexander. Every touch a gift he'd never expected to receive. They talked about everything, from their fears about being in their first same-sex relationship to their hopes for their future together, building on the foundation of friendship they had already established. "What are you thinking about?" Nicholas asked, noticing Alexander's contemplative expression as he leaned against the counter. "Just how happy I am," Alexander said honestly, setting down his coffee mug and reaching for Nicholas. 3 weeks ago, I thought I was going to have to spend the rest of my life pretending to be your friend while being in love with you. Now, look at us. Now look at us, Nicholas agreed, setting down his own mug and pulling Alexander into his arms, both of them still in their pajamas and messy-haired from sleep. Officially boyfriends, disgustingly happy, and completely in love. Disgustingly happy, Alexander repeated with a laugh, loving the way the words felt in his mouth. I like that. I like you, Nicholas said, pressing a kiss to Alexander's temple, breathing in the scent of his shampoo. Just like? Okay, I love you, I love us, I love this life we're building together. Alexander kissed him then, tasting coffee and contentment and the promise of all their tomorrows. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling, faces bright with love and possibility. So, Nicholas said, his arm still wrapped around Alexander's waist, ready to face the world as an official couple today? With you? I'm ready for anything. And as they finished their coffee and prepared to start another day together, Alexander realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that began with friendship, grew in the space between words unspoken, and bloomed when two people finally found the courage to tell the truth. Sometimes the person you were meant to love was standing right in front of you all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to see them, really see them, and take the leap. He was exactly where he needed to be, in Nicholas's arms, building a love that was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty it had taken to get there. And as Nicholas smiled at him over his coffee mug, eyes bright with love and possibility, Alexander knew that this was just the beginning of their story together.